The autumn sun barely peeped through the clouds as Dr. Michelle Richardson's alarm chimed at 6:30 a.m. Her perfectly pressed navy suit hung by the bedroom door, chosen specifically for today's faculty meeting where she would present her innovative proposal for restructuring Columbia University's first-year law curriculum. "Just once, I'd love for mornings to go as planned," she muttered, noticing her coffee maker had failed to start on its automatic timer. As a meticulous law professor who demanded excellence from both herself and her students, these small disruptions tested her patience. She quickly brewed her coffee manually while scrolling through her presentation notes one final time on her tablet. By 7:45 a.m., Dr. Richardson's silver Lexus glided through the quiet streets of Manhattan's Upper West Side. Her leather briefcase sat securely in the passenger seat, containing 3 copies of her proposal. She'd learned long ago that backup plans were essential in academia. The morning radio host announced unexpected construction on her usual route, forcing her to take an unfamiliar detour through a residential area. The dashboard clock read 8:07 a.m. as she carefully navigated the alternate route. The faculty meeting was scheduled for 8:30 a.m., and Dr. Richardson had never been late in her 15 years of teaching. Her students often joked that you could set your watch by her punctual arrivals to class. Lost in thoughts about her presentation, she almost missed the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Dr. Richardson checked her speed, 27 in a 25 zone, and signaled to pull over, maintaining her professional composure despite the growing anxiety about her timeline. She reached for her glove compartment, retrieving her license and registration with practiced efficiency. Through her side mirror, she watched the officer approach, his steps unhurried. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath, reminding herself of the countless times she'd lectured about the importance of remaining calm and professional in unexpected situations. Her phone buzzed with a message from the faculty secretary. "Meeting room is ready for your presentation." The irony of the moment wasn't lost on her. Here she was, one of Columbia's most respected law professors, about to be late for the first time because of a traffic stop. Sitting in her office later that afternoon, Dr. Richardson stared at the traffic citation on her mahogany desk. The morning's events had left her shaken but resolute. Her faculty presentation, though delayed, had been a success, but this piece of paper troubled her more than any academic challenge she'd faced. The citation listed 3 violations: speeding, failure to signal, and an expired inspection sticker. She knew with absolute certainty that 2 of these charges were incorrect. Her dashcam, a gift from her tech-savvy daughter, had captured the entire interaction. The signal light had clearly blinked 3 times before she changed lanes, and her inspection was valid for another 4 months. Professor Richardson. Her teaching assistant, James, knocked softly on her open door. "Your 2 p.m. constitutional law class is gathering." "Thank you, James," she smiled, tucking the citation into her folder. As she gathered her materials, her eyes fell on the framed photo of her grandmother, one of the first female attorneys in their hometown. "What would you do?" she whispered to the picture. Walking toward her classroom, Dr. Richardson's heels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor. The sound reminded her of her first court appearance 20 years ago. She'd been nervous then, but driven by a belief in justice. That same feeling stirred within her now. Her students stood as she entered the lecture hall, a tradition she'd never requested but appreciated. Today's topic, ironically, was about citizen rights during law enforcement encounters. As she began her lecture, the morning's incident crystallized into a decision. Sometimes, she addressed her class, the most important lessons in law come from personal experience. She pulled out the citation, holding it up. "This morning, I received this, and today, we're going to analyze it together." For the next hour, she turned her experience into an impromptu case study. Her students' enthusiasm and insightful questions reinforced what she already knew. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it would be easier to simply pay the fine and move on. After class, she opened her laptop and began drafting her legal response. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "The law works when good people choose to make it work." Dr. Richardson was ready to make that choice. The marble halls of the courthouse echoed with footsteps as Dr. Richardson found her way to courtroom 304. She arrived 45 minutes early, a habit ingrained from years of preparing for lectures. The polished wooden benches gleamed under fluorescent lights as she selected a seat with a clear view of the judge's bench. Opening her leather portfolio, she reviewed her prepared statement one final time. Her dashcam footage was queued up on her tablet, and her vehicle inspection documentation was neatly paperclipped together. As she waited, the courtroom gradually filled with mourning cases. A young man in a crumpled suit rushed in, frantically searching his pockets for what she assumed were court papers. An elderly couple helped each other navigate the narrow aisle between benches, whispering softly in Spanish. A court clerk efficiently arranged files on her desk, occasionally calling out names to verify attendance. Dr. Richardson observed everything with the same attention she gave to moot court competitions at Columbia. She noticed how the bailiff offered a tissue to a nervous teenage driver and how the court interpreter gently guided a confused visitor to the correct courtroom. These small acts of humanity within the formal legal setting reminded her why she'd chosen to teach law in the first place. Her phone vibrated. A text from her daughter. "Good luck, Mom. Remember, you're not just doing this for yourself." She smiled, thinking of how her daughter had inherited her sense of justice. The message reinforced her purpose for being here today. A sharp tap of the gavel announced the start of proceedings. Dr. Richardson watched as case after case moved swiftly through the system. Some outcomes seemed fair, others less so, but each one added to her understanding of this particular court's dynamics. She noticed Judge Whitman's efficiency, perhaps too efficient. Cases were processed rapidly, with little room for explanation or context. His responses seemed almost automated, decisions rendered before defendants finished speaking. As her own case time approached, Dr. Richardson made mental notes of his patterns, adjusting her planned presentation accordingly. "Next case," the clerk announced, shuffling papers. Dr. Richardson straightened her jacket, gathering her materials. Years of courtroom experience told her that the next few minutes would matter more than she initially thought. Case number 247, Richardson versus State, the clerk announced, her voice carrying across the now hushed courtroom. Dr. Richardson rose smoothly, her heels silent on the carpeted aisle as she approached the podium. Judge Thomas Whitman continued reviewing documents, his head bent over the stack of papers before him. "Another traffic violation," he muttered, more to himself than the court. His pen tapped rhythmically against the bench, a habit that had already appeared in several previous cases. The morning sun through the high windows cast shadows across his face, highlighting the slight furrow in his brow. "Your Honor," Dr. Richardson began, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used to command attention in lecture halls. "I wish to contest the citations issued on October 15th. She noticed his pen pause briefly at her professional delivery, though he still hadn't looked up. The judge's response came with practiced indifference. "The officer's report indicates 3 violations. Do you have any evidence to present in your defense?" His tone suggested he heard every possible excuse in his years on the bench. Dr. Richardson placed her tablet on the podium, pulling up the dashcam footage. "Yes, Your Honor. I have video evidence demonstrating proper use of turn signals, documentation of current vehicle inspection, and GPS data showing my exact speed at the time in question." For the first time, Judge Whitman's routine showed a slight crack. His pen stopped tapping. Most defendants didn't arrive with such thorough documentation. Still focused on his papers, he began his standard lecture about traffic safety and responsibility. Furthermore, Dr. Richardson continued, undaunted by his apparent dismissal, "I'd like to cite Thompson versus State, where similar evidence was deemed admissible in traffic court proceedings." The legal reference rolled off her tongue with the ease of someone who had taught the case countless times. The courtroom, usually a steady stream of whispers and shuffling papers, fell silent. Even the clerk paused her typing, sensing something different about this case. Judge Whitman's head remained bowed, but his shoulders tensed slightly at the precise legal citation. Dr. Richardson stood perfectly poised at the podium as she activated her tablet's display. The courtroom's overhead lights dimmed slightly for better visibility, and the gentle hum of the projector filled the silence. Judge Whitman's eyes remained fixed on his papers, his left hand absently adjusting his reading glasses. "If you'll observe the footage, Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the same confidence that had earned her Columbia's Professor of the Year award 3 times. "The timestamp clearly shows my vehicle's turn signal activating 3 seconds before the lane change." The video played with crystal clarity on the courtroom screen. Judge Whitman glanced briefly at the display, then returned to his papers. "Ms. Richardson, while I appreciate your thorough preparation—" "Doctor," she corrected gently, years of academic achievement evident in her tone. "Dr. Richardson, Your Honor. And if you'll permit me to continue, I believe the next segment of footage will address the speeding allegation." A slight murmur rippled through the courtroom. Few defendants dared to interrupt Judge Whitman, known for his strict adherence to courtroom protocol. The clerk's fingers hovered over her keyboard, waiting to see how the judge would respond. "As you can see," Dr. Richardson continued smoothly, advancing her evidence, "the GPS data overlay confirms my speed was precisely at the limit. Additionally, she retrieved her vehicle documentation. My inspection is valid through February of next year, making that citation particularly puzzling." Something in her methodical presentation style triggered a memory in Judge Whitman's mind. Her voice carried a familiar cadence, reminiscent of lectures he heard years ago. He shook off the feeling, focusing instead on maintaining his customary brisk pace. "Dr. Richardson," he emphasized her title with a hint of impatience, "regardless of your documentation, the officer's testimony." "With respect, Your Honor," she interjected, her words measured and precise. "The Supreme Court's ruling in Davis v. Washington establishes that electronic evidence of this nature carries equal weight to officer testimony, particularly when time-stamp verified and unaltered." The judge's pen stopped mid-signature. That case reference. He remembered struggling with it during his final year of law school, until a particular professor had explained it in a way that finally made sense. Judge Whitman's hand froze above the dismissal order he'd been preparing to sign. That voice, that particular way of citing case law, it tugged at a memory he couldn't quite grasp. For the first time since the hearing began, he lifted his head to look directly at the defendant standing before him. Time seemed to stop in courtroom 304. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as recognition dawned across his face. 12 years earlier, in a sunlit classroom at Columbia Law School, Professor Michelle Richardson had stood in exactly the same way, straight-backed, confident, commanding attention without raising her voice. "Professor Richardson." The words escaped his lips before he could maintain his judicial composure. The pen in his hand dropped, rolling across the bench and clattering to the floor. Nobody moved to pick it up. Dr. Richardson's expression remained professional, though a flicker of acknowledgement crossed her face. "Yes, Your Honor. Constitutional Law, spring semester of 2012, if I'm not mistaken. You wrote quite an impressive paper on judicial impartiality and implicit bias." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Judge Whitman's face flushed as he remembered that paper, 30 pages on the importance of examining one's own prejudices and preconceptions in the justice system. He'd earned an A+, and Professor Richardson had written a personal note encouraging him to pursue a career on the bench. "I believe," she continued with the same measured tone she used to guide hundreds of students through complex legal concepts, "that paper opened with a quote from Justice Thurgood Marshall about the importance of hearing every case with fresh eyes and an open mind." The courtroom remained silent, the air heavy with significance. The clerk had stopped typing, her fingers suspended above the keyboard. The bailiff, who had seen thousands of cases in this courtroom, stood straighter, sensing the weight of the moment. Judge Whitman looked down at the half-signed dismissal order, then back at his former professor. The morning's rushed proceedings, his cursory review of evidence, his dismissive attitude. Everything now reflected exactly what she had taught him to guard against. Judge Whitman sat back in his chair, memories flooding his consciousness. He remembered sitting in the front row of Professor Richardson's class, eagerly absorbing every word about the importance of judicial integrity. Her voice had sparked his passion for justice, shaped his understanding of the law, and ultimately led him to this very bench. "The court will take a brief recess," he announced, his voice slightly unsteady. The bailiff called out the usual instructions, but few people moved. The atmosphere in the courtroom crackled with anticipation. As he rose to leave the bench, Judge Whitman gestured to Dr. Richardson. "Professor, would you join me in chambers?" The judge's chamber felt smaller than usual as they entered. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating his framed law degree from Columbia University, where she had taught him. A copy of his celebrated paper on judicial impartiality sat in a glass case on the wall, a reminder of the principles he'd sworn to uphold. "Professor Richardson," he began, then paused, searching for words. "I apologize for my behavior in court today. I've become exactly what you warned us about in your lectures, a judge who sees cases as numbers rather than people." Dr. Richardson smiled gently, the same encouraging expression she'd worn when guiding students through difficult legal concepts. "Judge Whitman, you were one of my most promising students precisely because you understood that justice requires constant vigilance against our own assumptions." He walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "I've processed thousands of cases, trying to be efficient, trying to keep the docket moving. Somewhere along the way, I forgot the most fundamental lesson you taught us, that each case represents a human story deserving of attention." Turning back to face his former professor, Judge Whitman straightened his shoulders. "I remember you telling us that true justice happens when we have the courage to acknowledge our mistakes and correct them. I believe it's time for me to demonstrate that courage." The clock on the wall ticked steadily as mentor and former student shared a moment of understanding. What had begun as a simple traffic hearing had transformed into something far more significant, a reminder of the principles that formed the foundation of their shared profession. When court resumed, the energy in room 304 had shifted noticeably. Judge Whitman returned to the bench with renewed purpose, his posture reflecting the weight of the moment. Dr. Richardson stood at the podium, her tablet still displaying the evidence she prepared to present. "Before we proceed," Judge Whitman addressed the courtroom, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent earlier, "I'd like to share something with the court. 12 years ago, I sat in a classroom where an exceptional professor taught me that justice isn't about processing cases, it's about serving people." He picked up Dr. Richardson's citation, holding it where all could see. "Today, that same professor stood before me, and I failed to give her case the attention it deserved. Not because of who she is, but because I'd forgotten to give every case that same level of respect." The morning sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting a gentle glow across the proceedings. Judge Whitman continued, "Having reviewed the evidence properly, I find no basis for these citations. They are hereby dismissed." He paused, then added, "But more importantly, I want to thank Dr. Richardson for teaching me twice, once in law school and again today." Dr. Richardson gathered her materials, a subtle smile playing in her lips. "Your Honor, may I add something?" At his nod, she turned to address the full courtroom. "In my classroom, I often tell my students that the law is a living thing. It grows not just through new legislation, but through moments like this, when we pause, reflect, and choose to do better." The next day, a memo circulated through the courthouse announcing new procedures for traffic court. Cases would be scheduled further apart, allowing more time for each hearing. Judge Whitman's courtroom became known for its careful attention to detail and respect for every citizen who appeared before the bench. A month later, Dr. Richardson stood before her constitutional law class, sharing this story. "Sometimes," she told her students, "the most powerful lessons about justice come full circle. They remind us that in every courtroom, in every case, we have the opportunity to renew our commitment to the principles we hold dear." On her desk at Columbia, she kept the dismissed citation, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that teaching never truly ends, and that justice, when guided by wisdom and humility, has the power to transform both hearts and minds.